So I think we've been waiting for a while for China to go through this transition. They've had significant economic interests and energy interests in the Middle East, but they'd always kind of ducked out when it came to the politics of the region. They wanted to maintain good ties with all the major actors, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Israelis, the Egyptians, Turks, to a lesser extent the other Emiratis. That's been the kind of long-standing policy, and one of the things that they have seen as the most effective way of maintaining that has been to keep their head down on sensitive political issues. The question was always whether, particularly with the US drawing back in different ways from the level of its political engagement and military engagement from the region, whether China would see reason to start stepping up at some point, to start tilting some of the developments there in a direction that's closer to what they wanted to see. And that seems to be what's happened in this instance. China has had good reason to want to see improved relations between these two partners of it that it really does want to deepen relationships with in both cases. Economically, in energy ties, though they're already extensive, and in military and intelligence ties in different ways as well. But it's hard to do that when the two parties are significantly at odds with each other. Xi Jinping had kind of a difficult time in certain respects being able to navigate the politics of his visit to Saudi Arabia and the associated summit of Gulf states that took place, and the big deal that they did with Iran a couple of years back, because both sides react to some of these developments with the other. So it had been in a context in which China's trying to build this wider framework of friends. Squaring this was seen to be helpful, I think, on their part, and there were some things that they could do to smooth this along. But I think the crux in terms of the actors that have driven this have rather been the states themselves. This is still a zone of diplomacy that China in the Middle East is not always totally comfortable with. They've been happy to take a few risks in this case, and with the visits and the hosting and things like that. But I think they did this knowing that the chances of success at this stage were quite high. But politically, in terms of the impression it's created and the willingness to give China the diplomatic win on this, particularly on the Saudi side, I think it's an important threshold moment in terms of the perceptions of the Chinese role. And I think we are in a real transition in terms of the political role in the region that we can expect China to play. I mean, that's one of the other preconditions for what we've seen happening here, that because dynamics between the United States and Saudi Arabia have been what they've been in the last period of time during the Biden administration, I think the willingness to do this kind of slightly almost performative show of hedging and giving China political space and credit on these things that's the context in which the Saudis have been willing to do this. They would still like to have a different level of engagement and quality of bilateral relationship, but the US, for its part, is in a very different place now from where it used to be. I mean, it sees the level of commitment and energy to the Middle East as no longer making as much strategic and political sense as it did. There is a deliberate drawing back in that sense. There's a pullback of the military footprint in the region. And all of this also reflects the fact that the US doesn't need the region in the same way when it comes to energy ties as it did in the old framework on this back to the 70s. So the US can afford for the relationship with Saudi Arabia to head into this different place. There are reasons that this is, there's discomfort about the heightened Chinese role, and there are questions on what it means to have some of these actors rebalancing their wider kind of economic, technology, financial relationships, because I think for China's perspective, there's also a really heightened impetus at the moment to trying to figure out effective counter-sanctions coalitions, essentially kind of a non-Western framework between a number of the kind of major economies and trading powers. And Saudi Arabia is particularly important when it comes to that, as we've seen with things like dollar pricing for oil or renminbi pricing for oil and some of these issues as well. So there are reasons for the US, I think, to have some concerns about what this might amount to. But I mean, this is a decision they've made, which is to step back from that level of commitment. And it's a space in some areas where China is having to step in a bit more, even to some extent a bit more than they would have liked to themselves. They benefited a lot from free riding in the Middle East, and I think it's harder for them to maintain that now. I mean, I don't think China is fully in prime time position on the Middle East yet. They're feeling their way into this. This was them being given a lot of political credit for something, partly for the symbolism of that. I don't think it necessarily reflects a view that China is really moving into a kind of a much more comprehensive political role in the region. We've seen with their efforts in the past on Middle East peace plans and things between the Israelis and the Palestinians, how limited their capacities have been in some of these areas. I think we're getting more political visibility for what China's role is in the Middle East now. The comfort level with being seen to be active in this way has gone up, but there are still going to be some limitations to that. And we're still talking about, in the case of the Saudis, though not the Iranians, a significant level of hedging that will continue. This isn't a kind of, as it were, pivot to China. This is a balancing of relations, a rebalancing of relations to give China a heightened role. This is something that in different respects actors in the region have been asking China to do for a long time, and where China's been very reluctant. But the US is still going to maintain a significant presence and level of involvement. China's not suddenly sweeping in as some kind of new dominant actor in the region. That would be unrealistic. But we are expecting to see China starting to punch at its weight. It was punching below its weight before this. Well, there's still lots of mysteries about what the Global Security Initiative actually amounts to. We've seen speeches, we've seen papers. The content of it, though, still remains as much kind of defined against other things as defined for anything in particular. It's kind of an anti-alliance strategy in a sense. It's wholly directed towards the developing world. When it says a global security initiative, it essentially means an initiative for security with other developing world partners. And the aim is to, in a sense, reduce the capacity for the US to build effective rival blocs. This is China doing some of its own bloc building with a core group of countries, and then trying to ensure that a wider group of countries are at least as friendly as possible, and that they certainly don't go into something that looks more like a US allied camp on this. And certainly as well, as we've been seeing from things like China's heightened efforts at stepping up its military basing in a number of countries, whether it's Cambodia or Tajikistan, or military agreements with the Solomon Islands. We're seeing a much more global sweep in terms of China stepping up certain forms of security cooperation much more directly. And I think interestingly as well, just trying to improve ties between other Chinese partners in security terms as well. Of course, we've seen things like the joint military exercises that China and Russia have conducted with Iran, but also with countries such as South Africa as well. And so some of these are perhaps at least clues as to some of the content of what the Global Security Initiative is supposed to add up to, but it's much less clearly defined than something like the Belt and Road Initiative, to take the kind of, one of the obvious points of comparison in this. And I think when you look at the details of what's being spelled out for a lot of the countries involved, this is still something that lacks clarity, but I think we can see what China wants, broadly speaking, and it's bloc building, and it's a heightened global security role, and it's trying to ensure that countries stay out of the Western camp. I mean, this is the thing with the kind of building frameworks on sanctions that are more resilient. There are lots of countries that don't want to find themselves at the wrong end of US financial sanctions. Even some friendly countries to the US don't want to find themselves on the wrong end of this. And so I think the idea of building a framework that ensures that states are able to trade and conduct other forms of financial business with each other in a way that is better protected against the risk of countries being on the wrong end of this. And that certainly includes the Saudis. I mean, Iran is already very much at the wrong end of US financial sanctions. But I think this does have some wider appeal. I think states want to be able to continue to conduct business with each other with some level of confidence. At the same time, the capacity on the US side to be able to do this, to take these measures, is still, for a globally integrated economy that's highly dollar dependent, still extremely strong. And so I think it's challenging for China actually to take the steps that are required to do this. We're certainly not going to get some kind of great moves towards renminbi internationalization or something like this. But I think we can see efforts underway, at least to try to, particularly as we're seeing with Russia right now, where China is one of the actors that's helping to ensure the flow of trade and finance in the middle of Western sanctions here. But there are other states that want to benefit from this. We've even seen that in the case of India with some of the energy flows in the case of Russia and Chinese support even for some of the financial transactions there. So I think there is fertile territory for China to do this. I think the question is just going to be how far countries are really willing to go to be willing to take steps that would really amount to a kind of parallel economic bloc. And I think there are plenty of countries that, notwithstanding the fact that they want to hedge with China, also still want to maintain a foot, at least in plenty of cases much more than that, in healthy economic relations with the West too. And so I think this is putting countries in a difficult position, because I think the squeeze is very much on making choices right now on which side of these kind of rival developments, whether it's technology relations or financial or trade relations or things, you're going to pick in all of this. And I think those pressures are going to become greater as Chinese efforts to try to build this kind of architecture intensify. At the moment, countries can still hedge pretty well. Saudis are certainly hedging very much on all of this, but I think the decisions on these issues are becoming more zero-sum and more binary.